How would you characterize the last few centuries in the West? What are some components of the last few centuries that have been beneficial to society, and what are some components that have not been beneficial to society? Of course, I am a free markets proponent. I believe that businesses should be run and should be independent of government interventions, especially steep government interventions. And for that reason, I'm also a supporter of what's called capitalism. That means that I am not a supporter of communism or Marxism, and especially Marxism as it's been defined by Karl Marx and others and implemented in societies such as the USSR, China, and Cambodia. And of course, North Korea, Cuba, and China still retain communistic ideas. In fact, the president of China right now is becoming more authoritarian in these days than ever. So, what are some characteristics of Western society that we see right now? Well, we see people advocating for abortions very commonly. We see people advocating for communism. We still see that. We see people advocating for pornography, sexual deviance, prostitution, euthanasia, Freemasonry, relativism, modernism, postmodernism, and scientism. So we see a lot of that going on, and that is not a good thing. That is not a beneficial thing. And a lot of this crept forward in the first place from the 18th century. So we have a lot of people who started off, especially in German universities, where they had the presuppositions, the atheistic presupposition that God does not exist. And of course, that linked into biblical scholarship. And we see evidence of that. So I'm going to give a little presentation on some of the evidence that we have for the way that a lot of the modern scholarship coming out of atheistic circles is highly flawed. And the flaws are based on the flawed foundations, which is the foundation that God doesn't exist. And therefore, no prophecies can possibly be in the Bible because they understand the theoretical implications and theological implications of prophecies, especially very specific prophecies, such as Isaiah's prophecy of King Cyrus. So we're going to discuss some of that, and then I'm going to present some evidence to debunk some of their notions. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So here's what Riedorf said in 1997. It has become almost a truism to say that Pentateuchal studies are in crisis. What really is in crisis, of course, is not that those studies themselves, but the foundation upon which they were built. It has been my hunch that scholars who originated the Deutero-Isaiah proposition in the 18th century did so because of theological implications of specific fulfilled prophecies. Unfortunately, we have much evidence in support of my assertions, some of which I'll share. Scholars' judgments on the dating and authorship of Isaiah began with the assumption that Isaiah couldn't have known about King Cyrus or the Babylonian exile in his time. So they have attributed portions of his book to an unnamed author or authors who lived when the prophecies were fulfilled. Using this formula, these scholars can nullify all of the prophecies in the Bible except those that occurred after the closing of the Jewish books of Moses and the prophets. They believe prophets weren't really prophetic. Rather, they were merely godly men whose names had prestige and whose words only sparsely appear, if at all, in the text attributed to them. And of course, that is coming from Burges. They believe the Jewish scriptures were composed over centuries by a series of named and unnamed authors. The named authors, such as Jeremiah and Isaiah, may have written portions of the books attributed to them, but according to them, others added to their books in a series of insertions over centuries, just as one could add structures and designs to a great cathedral. In a nutshell, they believe Isaiah is an ancient version of Wikipedia, as both have been authored and edited freely and anonymously over a period of years. Fortunately, people don't hide their anti-theistic biases in their writings, which is evidenced by a quotation from Ulrich Burges of the University of Bonn. Rather than paraphrase his wording, I will quote him directly. Quote, "The historical gap of more than 150 years, which lies between Isaiah at the end of the 8th century and the time of the end of the exilic period presumed in Isaiah 40 to 55, Cyrus's decree in 539 B.C.E., could, with the rise of the historical critical Bible interpretation, no longer be overcome merely by referring to the visionary power of Isaiah. To compound matters, Isaiah is said not to only have announced the prospect of salvation, but also to have mentioned the name of the new Persian ruler, Cyrus II, who ruled from 559 to 530 in Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. It was this problem, of course, note the atheist has to call this a problem, which gave rise toward the end of the 18th century to the argument between and rationalist interpretations. This argument was not only concerned with the question as to which words can be traced back to Isaiah, but more fundamentally with the question as to what rationally comprehensible accreditation one was prepared to give to the prophets and what not. This is of utmost importance to the emergence of the Deutero-Isaiah hypothesis. Johann Christoph Döderlein, who lived between 1746 and 1792, the professor at the Franconian University of Altdorf, writes, quote, "The dogmatics of Christians cannot be the dogmatics of the contemporaries of Isaiah, and where Cyrus is being described, I cannot think of the Messiah." He then poses the question, might it not be feasible that this entire chapter was only written down during the Babylonian exile? End quote for a second here. Notice what's happening. They're writing off the whole thing because they can't comprehend or can't understand or are not willing to accept the fact that there's godly inspiration. I'll go back to the quote. Only as late as 1789 does Döderlein formulate the thesis in the third edition of his Isaiah commentary that the oratio, or rather the entire book after chapter 40, cannot be attributed to Isaiah, but that it was written at the end of the exilic period by an anonymous, or rather a homonymous, prophet. Because of this, Johann Christoph Döderlein is considered to be the discoverer of Deutero-Isaiah, and justifiably so, for in doing so, he found middle ground between the rational and the orthodox view. The solution was as simple as it was brilliant. Isaiah 40 to 55 was not written by Isaiah ben Amos, but rather by an inspired prophet whose name and identity, however, remain unknown. End quote. Now, Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, who lived between 1752 and 1827, grabbed Döderlein's baton and circled the track in his book entitled Einleitung in das Alte Testament, or the Introduction in the Old Testament, in 1783, which, quote, enjoyed an unusually broad distribution outside of the circle of professional biblical scholars, end quote. From his book and others in the 1800s, a new proposition developed among scholars that, quote, assumed a later exilic composition of Isaiah 40 to 66. Note the word assumed, okay, which suggests that later composition is a given or a proven fact. This assumption isn't unusual in these scholarly circles. Bernard Doom, he's the one pictured, of course, on my title slide, he lived between 1847 and 1928, jumped onto this new bandwagon with his proposal of a three-part division of Proto-Isaiah from chapters 1 to 39, Deutero-Isaiah 40 to 55, and Trito-Isaiah 56 to 66. He further distinguished the servant songs of Isaiah 42, 1 to 4, 49, 1 to 6, 54 to 9, 52, 13 to 53, 12 as later insertions. Doom argued that all three divisions were written over centuries, ending as late as the 2nd century BC. Notice that they always have to end everything by the 2nd century BC. Of course, that's because the Dead Sea Scrolls were found at this time, and they realized that what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're not going to be able to pretend that people are making these later insertions. So thankfully, the Dead Sea Scrolls has stopped these faulty scholars in their tracks. Three-part divisions, when he observed successive literary steps in Deutero and Trito-Isaiah and the Isaiah 35 bridged Proto and Deutero-Isaiah. Rejections, acceptances, and others on unity and divisions have persisted in the decades since. Many scholars today believe Isaiah was composed via a long editorial process, which started with a basic core and various insertions over centuries. Among the reasons given to support Deutero-Isaiah are varying content, authorial intent, structure, and styles between proposed divisions. None of these variations establishes multiple authorship or later dating beyond a doubt, however, because authors may vary their own styles, structure, intent, and content depending on the way they feel their messages will be best communicated. The ancient evidence we have in support of a divided Isaiah is elusive. Nathan Mastniak in 2020 has identified only two ancient items. One, in the Leviticus Rabbah 6:6 and 15:2, Rabbi Simon attributed the passages in Isaiah 8:19-20 to a prophet named Beeri. Since Beeri's prophecies weren't enough for his own book, Rabbi Simon said they added them to Isaiah's. This Jewish Midrash text was written around 500 AD, around 1300 years post-Isaiah. And two, the Great Isaiah Scroll includes Greek paragraphoi, or paragraphs of two types. One type is a horizontal dash in the margin. This type appears 60 times, and these correspond to major section breaks. The second type is a horizontal strike topped with a semicircle. This type appears in the Great Isaiah Scroll in certain parts and does not appear in any other Dead Sea Scrolls. The breaks seem to indicate a change in the speaker or the subject or focus, such as whether God is being spoken about or whether he is speaking. These divisions also give us information about the Lord's qualities and to whom the glory goes. So note that the first 39 chapters of Isaiah are very similar to the Old Testament. And what they are is their lamentations and their God warning people that if Israel does not improve, there will be punishment. And he cites specific issues of these punishments. But then we also have Isaiah 40-66 that are very similar to the New Testament. In Isaiah 40-66, we see a lot of messages about the suffering servant who's going to come and liberate the people, but only a remnant of the people will actually recognize him. And of course, that exactly happened. Isaiah 53 is something that steps out in front of us and actually kind of bothers some atheists. I want to say hi to Slam RN in the chat. So good to see you. Yes, those pesky Germans. I'm a pesky German myself, so I can say that about those pesky Germans. So yeah, happy Friday. We'll just keep that right up there. So thank you so much, Susan, for stopping by. So I want to just mention a few of the Isaiah prophecies that really kind of bother some of these people. And I think it's funny that one of the biggest ones is, of course, King Cyrus. But we're going to go back to start to talk about some of these. Okay, here's what Cyrus said. I am Cyrus, king of the world, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters of the world, son of Cambyses, the great king, king of the city of Anshan, grandson of Cyrus, the great king, king of the city of, great-grandson of Tispes, the great king, king of the city of Anshan, eternal seed. He's just doing a lot of bragging. That's what they used to do. Of royalty, whose rule Bel and Nabu love, in whose administration they rejoice in their heart. So here's some of the things that were prophesied. Okay. So I would say that the ancient world is comparable to the Minecraft video game where people routinely expanded their kingdoms by destroying and plundering people, cities, and kingdoms. Some warrior strategists who plundered kingdoms in the ancient Near East enslaved, killed, or carted their captives off into exile hundreds of miles away from their homes. No one would want to suffer such a fate. So the ancient people built tall and fortified walls around their cities and stationed them with full-time guard posts. And so we have a lot of examples of that from classical historians like Herodotus, Strabo, Ctesias, Clitarchus, and Quintus Curtius Rufus. They had some estimates of the Babylonian wall sizes, and they exaggerated them a little bit according to excavations, but they were thick and sturdy. And Babylon was a very powerful kingdom. So the Old Testament recorded a lot of these adventures, if you want to call them that, with the successions of empires and claims of dominance. The idea of dominance over people groups was highly valued in ancient times, as were the kings who could squash other empires. Ancient kings often bragged about their conquests in propagandist records, as if might always made right, and the wealthy and strong were always superior to the meek, unhealthy, or poor. This mindset's evidenced in these ancient cylinders, like the Cyrus cylinder, and I just read what was on the Cyrus cylinder to you. So here's some of the things that Isaiah in the 8th century predicted. Now, Isaiah lived during the Jewish captivity under Assyria. So he was under the Assyrian Empire. And here's what he predicted. He predicted in Isaiah 14:24-25 that the Assyrian Empire would be destroyed. And it was destroyed around 609 BC. Here's what he said: "The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot, and his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder." And here's what he also said: "And the Assyrian army shall fall short by a sword, not of man, and a sword not of man shall devour him. And he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be put to forced labor. His rocks shall pass away in terror, and his officers desert the standard in panic, declares the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and whose furnace is in Jerusalem." That's in Isaiah 31, 8-9. He also said this in Isaiah 39, 5-8. "Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in your house, and that which your fathers have stored up till this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the place of the king of Babylon." Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good." For he thought, "There will be peace and security in my days." See how selfish he is. And so we also see Isaiah 37, 36-38. Now remember this, again, just to repeat, Isaiah was in the 8th century BC. These are decades before these events came true. But here's what he said: "And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god. Adrammelech and Trezar, his sons, struck him down with a sword. And after they escaped into the land of Ararat, Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his place." Another prophet in the years to follow Isaiah's time was Jeremiah. He lived between 650 and 570 BC. He predicted that the Hebrews would serve Babylon for 70 years. When did this 70-year period begin? It may have begun with a decisive military victory over the Assyrians by the Babylonians and Medes in 609 BC. The Assyrian Empire had been subjugating Judah and Israel for decades. Or it could have begun when the first Hebrews were exiled, including Daniel the prophet, following Nebuchadnezzar's victory in Carchemish over Egypt and Assyria in 605 BC. Here's what the quote says in Jeremiah 25, 9-12. "Behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against his land and its inhabitants, and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction and make them a whore, a hissing, and everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will banish from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the grinding of the millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste." So upon Assyrian defeat, Egypt and Babylonia struggled to gain power over those in the Levant by engaging in a series of battles. The Levant refers to a large area in the eastern Mediterranean, containing the modern-day countries of Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Judah was highly desirable to both nations. Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt exercised his power by choosing a king of Judah in 609 BC, Jehoiakim. Around 605, Nebuchadnezzar's army defeated the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish, so Jehoiakim switched allegiances to the Babylonians. That same year, Daniel and his friends were taken into captivity, which is one reason why some have used this date to start the first of 3 exiles under Babylon. The other 2 were in 597 and 586 BC. Jehoiakim's allegiance didn't last very long. A few years later, the Egyptians won in battle, so Jehoiakim hastily shifted positions and reclaimed allegiance to Egypt, which infuriated Nebuchadnezzar. In the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus wrote that Nebuchadnezzar slew Jehoiakim, which occurred in 599 BC, and other Jewish elites, and commanded that his body be thrown before the walls with no burial. More Hebrews were exiled in 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed their temple. For 70 years, they were without a temple until around 516, 515 BC when they rebuilt it, when it was finished, the second temple. Now, notice what happened in 539 BC, 70 years after the 609 conquering. We, of course, had the Medo-Persians take over from Babylon, as predicted by Isaiah and by Jeremiah with the 70-year period. So, interestingly, Isaiah also predicted the destruction of the first temple. He said that this was going to occur. Here's what he said in Isaiah 63, 18 to 19. Your holy people held possession for a little while. Our adversaries have trampled down your sanctuary, which is the first temple. We have become like those over whom you have never ruled, like those who are not called by your name. He also said this in Isaiah 64, 10 to 11. Your holy cities have become a wilderness. Zion has become a wilderness. Jerusalem, a desolation. Our holy and beautiful house where our fathers praised you has been burned by fire, and all our pleasant places have become ruins. Now, of course, he also predicted the Medes and the Persian rise to power. Here's what he said in Isaiah 47, 11. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans. But evil shall come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. Disaster shall fall upon you, for which you will not be able to atone. And ruin shall come upon you suddenly, of which you know nothing. And he also said this in Isaiah 13, 17 to 19. Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver and do not delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. Very similar passages you can find in Isaiah 20, 9 to 10, and Isaiah 40, 20 to 23. But here's the real clincher, the real one that really bothers the atheist. Isaiah 45. Here's what it says. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exiled places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. King Darius the Mede co-reigned with his relative King Cyrus the Persian. In Daniel 8:20, Daniel called our attention to the alliance between the Medes and Persians, which corresponds to his prophetic dream about the ram with two horns. Following the writing on the wall incident around 539 BC, the final Babylonian king Belshazzar was killed, and the reign of Medo-Persia began. By around 537 BC, King Cyrus of Persia issued a decree to rebuild the Jewish temple, and some Hebrews began to return to Jerusalem. In 535 BC, they laid the first foundation of the second temple. And here's what Ezra 1 to 2 says. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. The prophet Jeremiah further prophesied that the Lord raised up kings of the Medes to destroy Babylon, and that Persia, called Elam, would rule the land, but their time would come to an end also. So here's also what Isaiah predicted, which occurred around 537 BC. Isaiah 27, 12 to 13 says, in that day, from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, the Lord will thresh out the grain, and you will be gleaned one by one, O people of Israel. And in that day, a great trumpet will be blown, and those who were lost in the land of Assyria, and those who were driven out to the land of Egypt, will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. And you can see similar passages in Isaiah 14, 1 to 2, Isaiah 6, 11 to 13, and Isaiah 45, 13. In Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus recounted how Jeremiah had conveyed specific prophecies which originated in Isaiah about the fate of Jerusalem, along with his own prophecies on the Persians and Medes and 70 years of exile. So he also mentioned that sort of a thing. Other prophecies about rebuilding the temple came about after this period of time by Ezekiel in 4048, who dated this prophecy in the 25th year of exile and 14 years after the city Jerusalem was struck down, which occurred 572 BC. Haggai also shared the Lord's vision concerning rebuilding the Jewish temple. He said in Haggai 1 to 4, "Is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins?" Haggai 1:8 says, "Go up to the hills and bring wood and build a house, that I may take pleasure in it, and that I may be glorified, says the Lord." And Haggai 2:9, "The latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts." Jeremiah heard from the Lord at the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah of Judah that the Lord would bring back the captives of Elam or Persia. Zedekiah was appointed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon to be the king between 597 and 586, when the first Jewish temple was destroyed. In Daniel 9:2, the prophet Daniel recounted Jeremiah's fulfilled prophecy. He says, "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years." King Cyrus the Persian was the first king to open doors to Jerusalem for the Hebrews exiled in Babylon. 42,360 Hebrews and 7,337 male and female servants left Babylon and made the months-long trek to return to Jerusalem and their previous towns. Once they arrived, their first step was to construct the second temple. So they collected funds for the temple treasury and began construction on the altar. Temple construction was further aided by King Darius I, who reigned between 522 and 486 BC, who issued a decree to support rebuilding efforts and made financial contributions himself. He gave them whatever they needed because he believed God might bless him and his sons. The second temple was finally completed in 516, 70 years after the destruction of the first. Notice the significance of 70s. The next project would be to rebuild all of Jerusalem, which was still in ruins under Persian King Xerxes, who reigned from 486 to 465 BC, and Artaxerxes, who reigned around 465 to 425 BC. To his credit, King Artaxerxes issued a decree to the prophet Ezra around 458, which gave Ezra wide-ranging authority to appoint legal magistrates to teach the law of God and to beautify the temple. Ezra and his companions traveled to Jerusalem, where he exercised his new authority. In Artaxerxes' 20th year, in 445 BC, his cupbearer Nehemiah prayed and asked for his protection and permission to travel to Jerusalem to rebuild the city. Being a cupbearer was a prestigious role that kings awarded to attractive men who were knowledgeable and trustworthy. A cupbearer's role was to take the first taste of the king's food and drinks in case someone had tried to poison him. Nehemiah's first project was to rebuild the walls and gates of Jerusalem, since they were still in ruins. As governor in the land of Judah, he led a group of Hebrews in their building efforts. Of course, their efforts didn't go unnoticed by their enemies. When one is called to work for the Lord, his spiritual opposition musters up forces to hinder him or her. Nehemiah ended up having to arm some of his helpers with weapons to protect them from angry opposers. Nehemiah gathered up records of the exiles who had returned and called people to a meeting in the square before the Watergate. There, Ezra, the priest and teacher of the law, read the book of the law of Moses to the Hebrews. And you can see what he read if you want to see the specifics in Nehemiah 9, 2-6. The events in Nehemiah and Ezra coincide with Daniel's 9, 24-27 prophecies from decades earlier. He says, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin and to atone for iniquity, to bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, or sevens, 7 sevens. The word for weeks could be used to be sevens. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Weeks can also be translated as sevens, as I pointed out, which gives us a timeline for the cutting off of the anointed one, which is Jesus, of course. We can either use the 457 start date, when Ezra was given authority to do what he needed to do in Jerusalem to restore it, or the 445, 444 start date, when Artaxerxes granted Nehemiah protection and permission to return to Jerusalem to rebuild it. Jerusalem would remain standing in the centuries between, though it would face difficult times. From the time of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, Daniel prophesied that 69 sevens would pass, which is 483 years. The calculation of dates is a little difficult since our Gregorian calendar, which is a 365.25-day year, does not precisely correspond to the ancient Jewish calendar, which was based on lunar with varying adjustments for solar cycles. Using the Gregorian calendar, we land on a window of time between 27 and 39 AD, after which we account for no year zero between 1 BC and 1 AD. People have estimated Jesus' crucifixion date to be either 30, 32, or 33, yet I find scholarly arguments and geological support for earthquakes that date the event in 33 AD to be the most compelling. It is interesting to note the likely Jewish sabbatical years of 26, 27, 33, 34, and 40, 41 as well. If we think of sevens, we can note that Jesus' appearance would be within the first set of sevens, 483 years following the 457 BC decree. I find that stuff interesting. And there's a lot more where that kind of thing has come from. So I'll say hi to everybody. Hi, hallelujah. Good to see you. And hi to Morlowin and Ars. If you are going to make prophecies, at least have the decency to make them more vague. Yeah, that's so funny you say that. Ours, yeah, they don't like some specific prophecies like the naming of Cyrus. And they have this idea that somehow these people were inserting passages over centuries, and somehow this went unnoticed by people in the temple. I mean, if you had copies of the Bible, and we do know that people who were in ancient times were making copies of manuscripts. We have evidence of that from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes, who made many copies of scrolls. And so people would have copies of their own scrolls in Isaiah's time, and the propositions that these people are making in the 18th century are basically that somehow some people went around to all of these different scrolls and inserted passages. It's complete lunacy. It doesn't make any sense. And so it's not something that I think anyone should accept. They also do not like what Daniel said about Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, this one really bugs them, and I've made lots of videos on Daniel, so I won't get too much into that. But it's very interesting because what Daniel portended in Daniel 9:24-27 was the especially troublous period in the Second Temple. Now, this occurred under Antiochus Epiphanes. He was an abomination of desolation who gave us a preview of the Antichrist to come in the end times. Antiochus forced the Hebrews to build temples and to erect idol altars for the sacrifice of pigs. He also outlawed circumcising males, observing the Sabbath, and possessing Jewish holy scriptures. He demanded the worship of Zeus and forced Greek ideals on citizens. His masculine ideal was exemplified in the gymnasium that was built by wayward Hebrews in Jerusalem, where people routinely engaged in the Grecian way of living, where appearing naked in public had been normalized. Let's just hope that the Grecian way of living doesn't creep into our society. We've already got some terrible things going on, like I mentioned at the outset, with abortions and people trying to claim that life doesn't begin at conception, or that people who are in the womb are not people. All these different kinds of things that people have accepted in modern society is a function of satanic beliefs. It's a function of Satan. It's predicted. It had been predicted years ago that this sort of thing was going to happen. Mother Mary made a lot of these predictions in some of her apparitions. We also have other sorts of things that have occurred in modern society that through communism, through atheism, through the idea of Freemasonry. If you ever look into this, the Freemasons are sort of a rather secretive group. And when you become a Freemason, apparently you have to go through a bunch of levels. You want to get to the 33rd degree. Apparently, that's the highest level of Freemasonry, the most secretive level that you can get to. And they are very much against Catholics, which is why Catholic popes going back to the last couple centuries have been repeatedly saying that people should not follow them. Catholics should not follow or become Freemasons. They believe in ideas like abortion. They like the idea of abortion. They like the idea of limitations in humanity. They like the idea of pornography. They like prostitution, euthanasia, all those things. They are moral relativists. They don't believe there's an absolute truth. In fact, they say there's no absolute truth, but the idea is then that's making an absolute truth statement. So they're self-refuting. But going back to what we have with Antiochus Epiphanes is the idea that Daniel had predicted that. And Daniel also prophesied the 4 kingdoms of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome through Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2, and in his own visions and dreams in Daniel 7 and 8. Greece would be like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. Note that Alexander the Great ruled Greece between 336 and 323 BC. In only a handful of years, he conquered thousands of miles of land and amassed a massive empire. Upon his passing, his 4 generals, Cassander, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Seleucus, split up the kingdom. Remember again, Daniel prophesied with the 4 wings of a bird. Here's 4 people who inherited the kingdom. Antiochus the Fourth, or Antiochus Epiphanes, he called himself that, which meant God manifest, or Antiochus Epimanes, which is the mad, was a descendant of Seleucus. As for the ram, here's what we also see written. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, Darius the Mede and Cyrus. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king, that would be Alexander the Great. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and with his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but not by human hand. Daniel said that. That is Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel, of course, was writing in the 6th century BC. Now, the atheists who see this can't take it because their presuppositions are that there's no truth to godly prophecies, have made up the notion that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC. And they think that somehow the person was duping duping the Jews of his time, which is ridiculous. Here's what he said. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offering, because of transgression. It will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. That's in Daniel 8:8-14. Now here's what Antiochus Epiphanes, he reigned from 175 to 164 BC when he died. In 169, he plundered the Second Temple, and in 167, he desecrated it by building an altar to Zeus and demanding worship of him. Daniel 12:11 says, and from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1290 days. That works out. You can see why Porphyry in the 3rd century AD, who first proposed the Daniel is written in the 2nd century hypothesis, did so because of how he recognized Antiochus Epiphanes, and he also had that flawed atheistic presupposition, or maybe in his case it was paganistic presupposition. The second book of Maccabees, Maccabees 9, detailed Antiochus Epiphanes' fate. The Jewish people, led by Judas Maccabeus, or the Hammer, revolted around 167, and Antiochus was eventually stopped. They had forced him to flee, which bruised his outside ego. So he decided to get them back by returning to Jerusalem and turning it into a mass grave. He set out on a chariot when God struck him hard with an invisible blow, which resulted in unbearable stomach pain. Now his fiery rage and arrogance fueled him as he raced again to Jerusalem, only to be thrown to the ground by God once again. He writhed in pain, with his flesh started to rot and stink, which continued to his death. Today, the 8-day-long celebration of Hanukkah is in remembrance of this Maccabean victory. Hanukkah is also known as the Feast of the Dedication because the Maccabees rededicated the Second Temple to God. When they did so, God caused a flame to burn on a menorah for 8 days on 1 day's worth of olive oil, which was a miraculous feat. As reported in John 10:22-23, Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, which today is known as the Festival of Lights. We should too. I want to come back to the chat just to say hi, everybody. So it's so good to see you. I'm so glad you came in today. I hope you'll like and subscribe and come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.